I got so much fun singing, I forgot I had to go to work. All right. How's everybody doing today? I hope you're good. I hope you enjoy church, because if this is boring, then you're, out of luck. If we have a good time, we worship a God who likes us to do that. Even as He is holy, He likes to smile. A couple of notes as we get rolling this morning. You'll see some new seating around. And we're thankful to Pond Hill Baptist Church, who actually donated a significant amount of seating to buy the seats that we picked up yesterday from. Would have cost about $6,000. Instead, it cost us $200 to rent a truck and go get them. So that's a pretty good deal, you got to say. So looking forward to the implementation, as some go and some come in. So just thankful for that. Hopefully you get a chance to sit in them. Looks like the back row is very full today, so you may have to wait till after church to hit one of the, but they all look happy and comfortable. So we'll see how that goes. All right. Genesis chapter 7 this morning. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 7. So basically you have a preface, you have a table of contents, and then you have the book of Genesis, and that's where we are going to be this morning. Genesis chapter 7. I am still, and I know I've talked about this before, I'm still kind of blown away. The Olympics have now come and gone. How many of you saw the article or heard the interview, how NBC described the alternative lifestyle of one of the snowboarders? How many of you saw this? You remember this? This is crazy, right? Now, snowboarders are not like the most sane people on the planet. Can we just start there? They do extreme sports. They get a little thin piece of fiberglass and they go 20 feet off the ground and they come back. They land on their feet sometimes, and they're just they're crazy people as a rule. But one snowboarder in particular caught the attention of NBC and the interviewer who said it, that he had an alternative lifestyle. Now I remember, I'm old enough. I realize I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember when alternative lifestyle meant something vastly different. Because now that's kind of an accepted lifestyle, if you remember that whole culture war through the 80s and 90s. But they said this guy had an alternative lifestyle. Now, here's how alternative his lifestyle is. He's 23 years old, he's married, he has a daughter, and he goes to church every Sunday. And that's an alternative lifestyle in the 21st century. Because everybody else amongst his peers in his age group, they may or may not have kids, and they may or may not know if they have kids, but they don't go to church. They do party all the time, and there is a reason they comb the hills all like they do. They're just a bunch of crazy people. But in that moment, I thought we really got a good snapshot of how our culture feels about us. The fact that you are here this morning, you have embraced an alternative lifestyle. Isn't that awesome? I get it all the time. Kate and I go out, and most of you know I'm married, and I have a daughter. I have 5 sons too. So when I go out, it's a lot of fun because people will do this, and you see them 2, 3, 4, and you can tell they're counting because they're not used to seeing people move as a herd apparently. And of course now my kids, if you see Kate and I, and you see all of our kids. We just really couldn't really give any of them away because they're all stamped in our image pretty firmly, and they're very clearly our kids. And so, I'll get all the time people like, "Are those all your kids?" I'm like, "No, I just picked up neighbors' kids." And yeah, they're all my kids. How many are there? I'm like, "You just counted, but there's 6." Wow, and they're all yours together? Because this is the crazy part. In 21st century America, my wife and I have been married for a number of years. I'll go 15 off the whim, just because I need to say something, right? No, it is 15. We've been married for 15 kids, and we have 6 kids all together. Not like half mine, half her. And if you're there, that's fine. But it's just different in our culture to actually have this happen. Any twins? Like, no, we did it all one at a time. Wow, you know how that happens, right? Yep, and we like it. And so we get the craziest comments and the craziest, but people just look at us like we have this alternative lifestyle. And our culture really has gotten to the place where Christians are made to feel marginalized, and that's not always an exciting place to be. Do you ever, as you're walking through your daily life, whatever it may be, in your alternative lifestyle existence and however that looks for you, that the people around you that kind of keep you at arm's length and treat you as you're just a little bit different and maybe a little bit weird and not necessarily an influence they want on their kids, lest their kids turn out to be like you. Does that get discouraging ever in your walk? I don't know about you. I do get it a little bit outside of church. I work full time in the business world myself, and so I get that occasionally where people know I'm different, and I'm fine with that because when they really need help, they know where I sit. Suddenly I get people, that ask, and so that happens, and that's a good day when that happens. But just that idea that I'm living an alternative lifestyle, and you read the news, and people start talking about, and I'm conservative politically too, which just is like 2 strikes. I'm looking for 1 more, and I'm dead, right? So you get, and it gets discouraging. After a while, it gets discouraging to say, I've vested all this time and energy and money and effort and blood, sweat, and tears, really, all 3 of those things, into trying to be godly. Somebody who loves God, follows God, serves God, worships God, is all about God. To have my peers and to have the rest of the world look on us so negatively is discouraging after a while. To think about the only person that you can, that it is safe to actually diss in a public spectrum today is Christians. Like you can bash Christians all day long. You bash Muslims, you're going to get hate mail. You bash Jews, you're going to get hate mail. You bash any other ethnic group, you're going to get hate mail. You bash Christians, and people celebrate. It's like the last bastion of beat it up, and that's us. And it gets discouraging. It can get discouraging. And when we get to Genesis 7, here's a weird thing that happens. It is a ray of hope shines through the deluge of a worldwide flood and provides us with the encouragement to continue going. And that's kind of an odd place. We're going to talk about a lot of rain, and yet through all of that rain, a ray of hope shines to encourage us. And so we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 7. Now, my goal this morning is actually to preach through the entire chapter and still be out of here while it's called today. Yeah, you can buckle up, baby. It's going to be a bumpy ride. So Genesis chapter 7, we're just going to go through this verse at a time. We'll see how fast we get. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." And so we found early on, as we were been talking about Noah over the last several weeks, that Noah was deemed righteous. And what's interesting is this is a different word than what we have run across before describing Noah. This particular word is an old Aramaic word, and it actually means someone who is a ruler of men and yet loyal to his God. And it's a very different kind of a reflection on who Noah was. He was righteous. He was right in God's eyes, and that much was certain. And yet as God describes Noah, he describes him as somebody who was a ruler of men and yet loyal to his God. And that's how the word kind of was used. And so we see Noah, at least in God's eye, being a man of influence and impact in his world. It's not clear how big a family he led. We can see from who got on the ark that he led about a whopping 8 people, counting himself. That's a small group of people to lead. And yet he led those people while retaining loyalty to his God. And after the ark, I think this is a little bit prophetic, because his kids started having kids and having kids and having kids, and he becomes a leader of men, and yet still retaining his loyalty to God. And I would say in our generation, regardless of who we are, of the influence we have and the impact we have, whether how great or how small, and you say, "Pastor, I don't have any influence," and I would say hogwash, because everybody has influence. Dads, you lead a group of people. It's called your family. You have a wife, you have kids. You are a leader of people. You have influence, and you need to lead those people well and retain your loyalty to God. Kids, you think, wow, I'm a kid. I don't have any influence in my house. And I would say double hogwash, because I have a whole mess of kids and I know better than that. Who is one of the most influential people in my home? I would say to you, it is Luke. Luke impacts how well I do or do not sleep. Luke is the name that we say most often in my house. Luke is the one that we need to know where he is at every second of every day, lest he be trashing something. Influence? He's got influence in spades. He has our attention all the time, and those few times that he doesn't have our attention, he gets it back in big ways. And so even children have an influence. You have friends whose lives that you impact, and you want to be that person in your generation, in your day, in your circle of influence, that you lead people where you are, and you are loyal to your God. It's not the easy road. It may be the alternative lifestyle, but it's the right road. And so God looks at Noah and he says, he is righteous. He is loyal to me in his generation. But we need to keep going. Verse 2, you shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. Also, verse 3, also each of birds, 7 each of the birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. Now, there's a couple things in these 2 verses. First of all, we run across this whole idea of clean animals and unclean animals, and most of us are thinking all animals are unclean, right? I have a bearded dragon, and you know what? The bearded dragon would seem to be clean. He lives in his own little case, but he sheds his skin, he eats, and he poops. He's dirty. I have 4 little guinea pigs running around their cages, and you know what? They stink, they eat, they drink, they pee, they're dirty. I have 2 cats. They eat, they kill, and they leave corpses all over the property during the spring and summer months, and they eat, and then yeah, you got it. I've yet to meet an animal that I would define as clean. I mean, even the ones that come pre-packaged from the grocery store, you have to wash your hands after you touch them because they're dirty. I mean, chicken will kill you, right? I teach my kids all the time, treat chicken like it's poison until after it's cooked. If you touch it in its raw state, wash your hands, wash whatever it touched, because the bacteria in raw chicken can kill you. So what exactly is a clean animal? Because in our experience, most animals are dirty, right? And here's the other trip about this. Most of what we know about clean animals and dirty animals is going to come to us from the book of Leviticus, later some in the book of Exodus as well. But God did not define in writing what a clean animal was and what a dirty animal was for several hundred years after this. The Exodus, all this happens hundreds of years later. And yet what we find is there was already an understanding, at least God knew, and an understanding among God's people of there was some distinction between what was a clean animal and what was a unclean animal. And so if you were to turn to Leviticus 11, and you can or not, it's completely up to you. We're not going to read a lot there, but Leviticus chapter 11 gives you a really good rundown of what is a clean animal, what is an unclean animal. And so we find beginning in verse 2, God says, these are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. And he gets kind of like the whole cattle thing. And then he gets down to verse 9, these you may eat in all that are in the water. And then he gets down to verse 13, and these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. And so he says, here's the birds you can eat, and here's the birds you can't eat. Verse 29, these shall be unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth. And so he says, here's all the insects, here's what you can and can't eat. Here's what's clean, here's what's not clean. In verse 41, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination. A lot of the bugs that are around there that people might be tempted to eat, God said, no, unclean. And so God breaks down, and I mean in like some painstaking detail, of what is unclean and what is clean. And at the end of it basically is this, verse 46, this is the law of the animals and the birds and every living creature that moves in the waters and of every creature that creeps on the earth, to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, and between the animal that may be eaten and the animal that may not be eaten. And so God had a definitive idea of what was clean and what was unclean from the beginning, though he was not going to write it down until hundreds of years later. And yet still there was an expectation that Noah understood the difference. God said, you're going to take 7 of every clean animal, and you're going to take 2 of every unclean animal on the ark with you. Now, the numbers are significant because you think about it, and we've read, clean animals, you can eat them. And so you need more of them. You need them to reproduce more rapidly than the unclean animals, because if they don't reproduce rapidly enough, what's going to happen? You're going to go hungry, right? Starvation. Don't overthink it. Some of you just listen to the growling in your stomach and let it answer you. And so just the idea that there would not be enough food to eat, there would not be enough leather to wear, there would not be enough wool to weave without enough clean animals. And so God said, take more clean animals with you because they're the animals that you eat. Take more clean animals with you because they're also the animals that you sacrifice. There are things, the animals that you could eat are also, many of them, the animals that you could appropriately sacrifice to God. And so you simply needed more of them, and you needed them to reproduce more rapidly. And so 7 accomplishes that where 2 doesn't. And you say, how did that ratio go? Because 2, obviously 1 male, 1 female. When you've got 7, you've got a 7th wheel somewhere. It's 3 male, 3 female, and 1, it doesn't matter because it's going to die. That's your first steak dinner as you get off. So it doesn't really matter. That's how the ratio plays out. It's like whichever you prefer to eat, to grab the 7th one of that, it's fine. And so they get these up there. And the idea here, and the whole purpose of the ark in general, we find it right here, is to keep the species alive. That's the whole intention here. God says, you're going to build this great big ark, and you're going to take your family on it, and you're going to take all these animals on it, and the reason you're going to do all of that is to keep the species alive. God had decided he's going to wipe out all mankind and most of animal kind as well, because animal kind exists for mankind. Less people, less animals, works out really well. But God said, I'm going to preserve these 8 people alive, but these 8 people are enough reason for me to preserve life. And so he says, keep these different species alive. And so we think about the ark, and I had some pictures I forgot to show you last week, so I'm going to rope them back into this week, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at the ark. We have a picture of the outside of the ark. There we go. Here's a picture, and you get a little bit of a scale. We talked last week about the ark being 450 feet wide and being, or 50 feet long rather, 75 feet wide and 45 feet tall, probably cubical. This isn't a bad picture. You think about some of the pictures you see of the ark, it's stylized, like you could steer it and navigate. Really, that was unnecessary. It was a floating barn, and all it needed to do was float. You didn't need to steer. There was no rudder anywhere in the instructions. It just had to float. So cubical in design is probably more realistic. The idea that Noah would spend decades bending wood to have this sleek design, not probable. And so we get this, you get a size of this. What you can't see, go back one, the square at the bottom there is the size of an American football field. And so you get an idea, size-wise, what the ark would have looked like sitting on, overlapping, over at Gillette Stadium, say. All right, let's go to the other one. We get a picture of the inside of the ark. God said make the ark with 3 floors, lower, second, and third. And so we get 3 floors, so it actually triples the capacity of the ark, and so you get kind of a cross-selection of what it may look like, stalls for all the species, because you don't want them all running around, because that's, it's bad enough the kids were doing that. You don't want the elephants doing that too. And by the way, God said take 2 elephants, not the 2 biggest elephants you can find, and the same goes for the dinosaurs that were on the ark. I believe they were there, but he didn't say take 2 of the biggest ones, and most dinosaurs actually started off life quite small and would have fit comfortably in an ark. Again, don't take the 2 biggest ones you could find. Take 2. And in a cold, dark environment, what do dinosaurs and lizards do? Many of them, they sleep. So perfectly safe. All right, next slide. And then there's a little bit of perspective on what the ark would have looked like next to a 747. I realize it's a 777 in the news. I don't really know how big one of those is. The graphic I had a 747. So you get that. Not big when you compare to the Titanic, which was, well, quite Titanic, wasn't it? It was large. So, give you kind of some perspective on how big this was. But the point of this was simply that God wanted to preserve the species. He wanted to preserve the human species, and he wanted to preserve the animal species. And so what we end up with is a boat that big with 3 floors, could carry, if anybody remembers the number, if not, I believe it's on the back of your program, but 125,280 sheep-sized animals would have fit on the ark. And so it was big enough to fit Noah and his family and all of the species on there. We know historically, for instance, that all dogs, all of the wondrous varieties of dogs that we have today, how many of you are dog people? Ruff, ruff. No ruff, ruffs, just hands? All right, I'll let you by with that. But all of the variety of dogs today, we're told that all of the different varieties and species and subspecies of dog actually came from probably 2 distinct dog species. Like everything that's out there today, it winds its way back to just 2 species of dogs. And so we think about it. So Noah had 8,000 different dogs on the ark. Probably not. He probably had like 4, because that's where the species came from. 2 different kinds of canines. And so, you think your way back through what is the different species, and there are a lot of different varieties of species, but, where is their common ancestry? And it was their common ancestor that would have been on the ark to preserve the species. And so God did that. The ark was plenty big for that, keeping people alive, keeping the animals alive. Let's keep going. Verse 4. Yeah, we're not doing so well. Verse 4, after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth. And so there's a bit of a sense of urgency. God's saying, look, you got a week left. We looked at it in chapter 6, and there was 120 years to go. We're down to 7 days, and it's going to start going. For after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were on the earth. And so you can feel bad for Noah. You can imagine how much ibuprofen he needed. That at 600 years old, he's building an ark. And at 600 years old, he's carrying in groceries for a lot of people. And at 600 years old, he's having to manage all of these animals. But it's an important time marker. And we're actually going to get a more specific one that's even better for us as we continue. But there's this sense of urgency that it's coming. Verse 7, so Noah, with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives, went into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth. 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. That's very specific, would you agree? And it's going to become more important as you find out when the floodwaters were gone and when Noah was able to finally get off the ark. We can actually boil this down to exactly how many days that he was on the ark, which is just kind of cool that we get that kind of detail. It doesn't really matter, but it's very cool if you're a detail person. Let's see. So in the 17th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And that's worse rain than they get in Seattle even. You could go to tropical nations, and they don't get rain 40 days and 40 nights. Not 40 days of nonstop rain. And you begin to ask yourself, how in the world did it rain for 40 days? And nights. I mean, it's not like Ramadan. Ramadan, the Muslims, they have this feast. They fast for 30 days. Sounds really impressive until you really see it, that it's just 30 days. They don't fast 30 nights, so they eat all night and they just fast during the day. This is 40 days of rain, both day and night, we're told. So this is constant 40. Where does that much water come from? You ever seen it rain for a few days and you're like, okay, Lord, I've had it. I don't know how the water cycle works, but I think that's enough. It's like, I don't know how the snow cycle works, but I know it's enough. I heard somebody mention snow this week is coming. I think I slapped him. I didn't really, but I felt like it. So to answer the question of, where does this much water come from, we just go back a couple of pages to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 6, and we actually find the answer of where this much water would have come from. Genesis 1, verse 6, God said, he's now creating the earth, God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. and let it divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And the idea of the firmament is the sky. It's this great void, this open expanse. And what God said was the sky was to separate the waters that were under the sky, what we might call the ocean, or God called the seas, from the waters that were above the sky, which is something that we don't have right now to see. But what God said was in creation, there was water that was close to land, and then there was this empty void expanse of sky, and then there was water above it. You say, where did all that water go? It rained for 40 days. God just popped the bubble, and it all... And so there was water that God had set out, and it made the world prior to the flood completely different from the world as we experience it today. It would have been a lot like living in a greenhouse in many respects that they did, but very different than what we know or experience today. But for 40 days, the water that was above the sky fell and landed all over the earth. And so you get this 40-day rainstorm. But then we're also told that great fountains of the deep were broken up. And if you've seen the previews for the movie Noah coming out, I think this weekend? This weekend coming? 28th? Thank you. They keep moving it around. It's like hitting moving target. But if you've seen the previews, you see these great jets of water just starting to erupt through the ground. The great fountains of the deep were broken up. And we begin to think, where might that have come from? And there's a couple things that we find. First of all, if you go back to, and we won't go there, but if you go back to just a couple pages into Genesis chapter 2, beginning in verse 10, in the Garden of Eden, we're told there's this river that just emerged from the Garden of Eden, not from any like known source that we might think of today. Most rivers come from mountains. It's snow that melts and it runs down the mountain, or rain that's caught and it runs down the mountain, becomes a river. We know how rivers form. But in the Garden of Eden, there was just this river that just emerged, and then it parted into four heads. Well, we have some of those today. Those are rivers that come from subterranean water. Water that comes out of the ground, and it became a river, and then it parted into four different rivers, and it just went around. And so we have a biblical account that there is water under the earth, and so it's not an unknown thing. But I actually saw this week, and it was great timing, this week I found an account in the news about subterranean water. Did anybody see this, about a diamond that was found? Chris did, great. So we read some of the same sites, that's scary. So on a Friday, March the 14th, and this is just a printout of the article from Fox News, you could chase it down everywhere. But on Friday, March 14th, this week, talked about a small diamond that was found that confirms a long-held theory that Earth's mantle holds an ocean's worth of water. That and the article plays out, and here's a picture of it. But basically, there is this transition zone between the upper mantle and the lower mantle. It's about 125 down to about 410 miles deep. And the stuff that was in this diamond, the diamond itself is not very worth very much, except for what's in it, is a chemicals, or let's see if I can find it here, and I don't remember what it was called. But anyway, it's from that transition zone. And so what they have figured, and we can't drill down 125 miles, but what scientists have begun to work out between stuff that's starting to emerge from volcanoes and stuff that's starting to emerge in the science of figuring out how our planet moves, is that in this transition zone, there is roughly the same amount of water in between the lower and upper mantle as occupies all of the Earth's oceans combined. And this isn't like Bible. I mean, this was published this week in the journal Nature, which is as evolutionary a scientific journal as ever existed. The great fountains of the deep. Gee, there's great fountains in the deep. I'm glad science is finally 6,000 years later catching up with the Bible. Way to go, science. But so there are great subterranean spaces, and beyond that, there are a lot of places in the world where there are just subterranean water. You think about the town of Rentham. If you live here, what kind of water do you drink every day of your life that you drink tap water? You drink well water because the town of Rentham is well fed. There are 3 or 4 primary wells and several secondary wells and watershed areas, but the water in the town of Rentham is well water. And I think that the water in the town of Rentham came out of the sewer, but the water, Franklin, not Rentham. Franklin has horrible water. If you're from there, I can only say I'm sorry. Get a Brita pitcher. But the water in Rentham is good, and it's all well water. Where does well water come from? Wells. Where are wells drilled? Down into the ground. Why would you drill a well down into the ground, except there is water down there, right? And so it's a known thing, although you get scoffers like, oh yeah, great fountains of the deep. Oh yeah, right. Okay, have some well water, pal. It's there. And so the great fountains of the deep were broken up, and we have all kinds of evidence starting to come out. This is a legitimate kind of thing that could and did happen. Lots of water under the ground, suddenly above the ground. Lots of water that was off the planet, suddenly on the planet. It was a mess. And what we find, if you were to continue reading, is that the water actually rose to 15 cubits above the highest mountain peak. Now, how long is a cubit? Oh, that was way too long a delay. We just did this last week. How long was a cubit? Right, your arm length, right? But we said generally it's about 18 inches. And so 15 cubits, somebody do math? You guys are killing me. 15 cubits, how much is that in feet? If a cubit is 18 inches, 15 cubits would be about 22 and a half feet. I know that some of you need to get your coffee refreshed, apparently. Or you need to go back to homeschool. All right, so 15 cubits, about 22 and a half feet. And so when you talk about water that stands 22 and a half feet over a mountaintop, is there any way to isolate that into a regional flood? No, because if it's over the mountaintop, what is left to stop it? Nothing, right. So global flood, that's what we're dealing with. Okay, so let's keep reading, shall we? Verse 13 is where we left off. On the very same day, Noah and Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and 3 wives of his sons with him entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, all cattle after their kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark, 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which is the breath of life. So those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, you get the idea that God wants us to really zero in on the fact that there was at least 2 of everything that went in the ark. If it needed air, it was on the ark. And if it needed air, it was on the ark. And if it had breath of life, it was on. You get this kind of redundancy that God's trying to make a point. Verse 16, so those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded them, and Noah shut the door. Okay, good. Some of you are looking at me like, which is good. You have your Bibles in, because Noah didn't shut the door. Let me reread that the way it actually says it here. And the Lord shut him in. God shut the door. One of the things that we cannot miss, and one of the things that you will see argued about, and I think when Bill Nye and Ken Ham debated a few weeks ago, this came up, though I couldn't stomach to watch the whole debate, I'll be honest. But people talk about, like the boat could not have been, could not have fit, could not have done, and they have all of these human reasons why the ark couldn't have worked the way it's described. Here's my answer to all of that, and it satisfies none of them, but it works perfectly for me. It's called a miracle because you can't explain it. When God shuts the door, and God's the one who makes sure the boat floats and navigates wherever he wants it to go and lands however he wants it to land, doesn't turn over because he doesn't want it to turn over, science is not the most relevant subject on the planet. When you're talking about miracles. Miracles, by their very nature, defy science. So anything that you think that science can't validate, I just go, it was a miracle. And that won't work for you, but it works just fine for me. God shut the door. God was in charge of this whole operation. It was God's boat, God's design, and God's job, quite frankly, to keep it floating. Because he wanted to preserve the species. And so whatever it was going to take for that to happen, wouldn't that have been a bummer if God gave Noah the design of the ark and Noah built the design exactly the way God said it, and the waters rose up and it's this global flood, and he's navigating around and he hits a big wave and the ark overturns and sinks? Well, for starters, we wouldn't be here to talk about it, but wouldn't that have been a bummer? So don't overlook the hand of God in this particular story. And when everyone says, oh, that couldn't have happened, well, just ask for how do you account for miracles? Because I don't know how you define, describe, use the scientific method on, and I have nothing against science. I like science. But at some point, science becomes irrelevant when God enters the picture because he can suspend, change, alter, and altogether ignore the laws of nature if he wants to because they're his. And he's God. And we're not. Problem solved, really. It solves a lot of problems. Anyway, I digress. Verse 17. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted the ark, and it rose above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. It just floated around like a little bobber in the lake. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits and upward, which is how many feet? 2.5. Right, we just did this like 5 minutes ago. Okay. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, or 22.5 feet, and the mountains were covered. Note in verse 21. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts of every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and some men. Or every man. Right, good, I'm glad you're reading. All in whose nostrils were the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on dry land died. Why was there no aquarium on the ark? Because fish can breathe water just fine. It's land animals that have a hard time with it. Don't overthink it, right? Well, what about whales? What about dolphins? They breathe air. Yeah, they can still surface. All right. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Catch this at the end of verse 23. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the water prevailed on the earth 100 days. Only Noah and those who were with him on the ark remained alive. If you weren't on the ark, you were, in a word, dead. Drowned. Because God had determined that all men were ungodly, all men were unrighteous, and all men warranted his wrath. And so he exercised it. But Noah was godly. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah is described by God himself as righteous, as loyal, as godly. Here's the ray of hope that we find in Genesis chapter 7. And this is going to seem really deep, right? Godly people preserve life. Godly people preserve life. Noah was godly. And it was only because of Noah that life continued. His godliness, his existence as a godly person was responsible for the preservation of life. That's what godly people do. That's the function we serve in our culture. People look at us and they laugh at us. And you know what we could actually turn and say, if we wanted to, the only reason you are here to be able to laugh at me is because I am here. And God hasn't judged this place yet because I am here. Not me personally, but us. Godly people preserve life. Why doesn't God blow the place up? Because we're still here. And when he gets ready to blow the place up, guess what he's going to do? He's going to take us out of the way. And not like in a bad way. He's going to take us to our reward, and then he's going to come down here and he's going to put a whooping on. But godly people preserve life. The reason God doesn't judge the planet is because we're still here. And he's not going to judge the godly with the ungodly. We preserve life. I remember I had the privilege of serving in the U.S. Army Reserve for a number of years, and I have mad respect for veterans and people who served and saw combat. The closest I actually came was being on alert in the 1st Persian Gulf War. My unit was on alert. Everybody was on alert because we had no idea what was coming. And I have mad respect. And you talk to veterans, and you talk to people who have served. And my dad is a veteran. My brother is a veteran. And so we have people who have served throughout my family and through many of yours, I'm sure, as well. And one of the things that people will tell you is, it annoys me a lot when I see people who hate my country, who disrespect my flag, who disrespect my government, though it has earned a severe amount of disrespect, don't mind. But one of the truths that people will tell you is that, that in the military, and you hear it and you're trained in it, is that I would die to give you the right to hate my country. And you talk to veterans, and they do. Why would I potentially risk my life for freedom? And that means even the freedom to disrespect everything that I would give my life to defend. And that's just part of the duality, the contrast of serving in the hopes of preserving freedom for a group of people who won't appreciate that freedom. But without that service, the freedom would not be there. And so it's a necessary thing. It's the same idea for us as Christians. For those of us who worship, serve God. We exist, even though people don't like us, we exist as an alternative lifestyle. We exist to be ridiculed, but were we not here, you wouldn't be here to ridicule us. Godly people preserve life. That's our function. That's our role. That's our purpose. And so when people look at you and they pick on you for who you are and who you serve, whose you are. One of the ways that we can be encouraged is the fact that if I wasn't here as a godly person, God would just squish you like a grape. And He doesn't, because I'm still here. Because godly people preserve life. And so I would encourage you this morning, and as you go out the week, living out your alternative lifestyle in our culture, be encouraged. You have a function and a purpose that is far greater than anybody around you understands. You preserve life just by your existence as a godly person. Is that cool? Can I get to that's cool somewhere? I mean, that's awesome. Let me encourage you one other thing. Godly people preserve life. That doesn't have to be passive. It can be active. Why is it that Christians have such a problem with abortion? Why is it that Christians have such a problem with euthanasia? Why is it that Christians have such a problem with physician-assisted suicide? Why is it that Christians in all of these great moral arguments of our generation always side on the side of life? Because that's what we're here for. We preserve life. Godly people preserve life. And so that can be an active thing as well, where we seek to preserve life. And sometimes that means taking a stand on contentious moral issues. People call them political issues. They're not political. They're moral. Don't misunderstand that. They're moral issues of our day, and we have an obligation, we have a responsibility to take a stand someplace, and we need to take our stand on the side of life because godly people preserve life. But it may just be in the day-to-day mundane things where somebody around you needs help. And sometimes you can preserve their life, making it that much better just by actually helping. But that's what godly people do. They preserve life. And that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. Some of it's passive, some of it just happens, but some of it is just active. And so as you are being encouraged that you have a purpose and serve a function in this world that they don't understand, don't appreciate, but rely on heavily, let me encourage you to find those active moments as well, where you can seek to preserve the life of the people around you. And that's going to look a lot different given the scenarios. But at every time, if you would say, I'm godly, I worship God, I love God, I serve God, I follow God, at every point and at every decision point, you ought to seek to preserve life. Why? Because that's what godly people do. And sometimes that makes the decision-making process a lot easier, doesn't it? How should I decide? You decide on the side of life, always. Godly people preserve life. Father, we love you. We thank you for the day. Lord, it has been a little bit long this morning, but just the idea of Noah getting on that ark and all that happened there. Father, ultimately, because you saw a man who was godly, and you preserved his life, and through him, you preserved life on this planet. You preserved human life, you preserved physical life of all the animals. All because of Noah, one godly man. Father, would you help us this morning to be encouraged to be godly because we have a purpose that is far greater than our world understands. That our existence, our pursuit of godliness is what preserves life to this day on this planet. Father, help us to be encouraged. Lord, if there are any here this morning who they're not sure, am I godly? Do I worship God? Do I serve God? Have I entered into a relationship with God? Have I been forgiven by God? Lord, would today be a day that they might say, I want to be godly because I see value in it. And Father, today might today be the day that they would turn to you and find salvation and godliness. And then, Father, for the rest of us, as we go about our lives, would you help us to live not just godly, but help us to live intentionally seeking out how we might preserve life around us. Because it's what we do, and it's who we are. Father, may people around us get a sense of that. But even if they don't, Lord, we want to be able to stand in such a way that you look at us and you see us as righteous, as godly, as loyal servants, as loyal people who preserve life. Thank you for it in Jesus' good name.